Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. The morning after Joe Biden's big speech, to be quite honest, I'm way more interested in Rudy Giuliani's bad day. But we should start with Joe Biden's speech. This was the new president's first chance to address a joint session of Congress. And there was a lot going on there. There's no question about it. I mean, Politico's John Harris says Biden just gave the most ideologically ambitious speech of any Democratic president in generations. And that's true. I think it's safe to say the era of big government is back. It's going to be an interesting challenge. He has teed up an epic debate. Here's another piece from Politico. President Joe Biden wants to soak the rich to give to the middle class and poor, and he ain't afraid to say so. In his first address before a joint session of Congress, the president embraced a tax and spend mantra to frame his next big legislative fight, walking right up to a third rail that has terrified Democrats for decades and forced his predecessors to triangulate and retreat to safer middle ground. But he also had these moments where he hit just an optimistic note of unity. Let's play one clip where he talks about America surviving one of its gravest challenges.
We've stared into the abyss of insurrection and autocracy, pandemic and pain, and we, the people, did not flinch. At the very moment our adversaries were certain we'd pull apart and fail, we came together, we united. With light and hope, we summoned a new strength, new resolve to position us to win the competition of the 21st century. On our way to a union more perfect, more prosperous, and more just, as one people, one nation, and one America. Folks, as I told every world leader I've ever met with over the years, it's never, ever, ever been a good bet to bet against America, and it still isn't. We're the United States of America. There's not a single thing, nothing beyond our capacity. We can do whatever we set our minds to if we do it together. So let's begin to get together. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you for your patience. Joining me today for the morning after the autopsy / analysis, our own Bill Kristol, who has a piece up in the Bulwark today saying that apparently the reports of liberalism's death may have been somewhat exaggerated. Good morning, Bill. How are you?
I'm fine. I love that. Thank you for your patience. That's a new close to presidential addresses, right?
Yeah. Thank you for sitting here for 65 minutes. Okay. So I confessed to you right before we started this that I'm suffering from severe cognitive dissonance. That I still really like Joe Biden. I really appreciate his decency. I am immensely grateful that he is the president, that we are no longer having to look at the former guy. But I have to say that I'm just listening to, and maybe it's a heart and head type thing, but listening to this fever dream of progressivism, by my rough calculations, in the last 100 days, he has proposed spending an additional $6 trillion. And that's on top of a whole bunch of trillions of dollars that we spent last year. And this is the most ambitiously left-wing presidency that we've had in generations. This is more FDR than it is Barack Obama. So how do we sort all this? How do we sort all of this out? I mean, is there any difference? But let me ask you this. I mean, what you heard last night, if Elizabeth Warren had been elected president, would we have heard anything different? Would it have been any different had she not, if she was up there, as opposed to the guy that ran as the centrist and the uniter?
Yeah, I think it would be different. So I'm a little friendlier to Biden, considerably friendlier actually to Biden's speech and maybe to his program, with a caveat that I think a fair amount of the program won't be enacted and some of it shouldn't be enacted. Not a fair amount, but some of it won't be. Maybe the last trillion or two, It's only a 4 trillion, Charlie, not 6, So it's that should cheer us up.
6.
So I think here's where it's complicated. I think there's a little bit, it's too simple in a way to say, it's more ambitious or certainly I don't think it's quite right to say more left wing. I would say this is big government liberalism. The bad news for people like you and me who've read read and I think continue to believe a lot of the criticisms of big government policies, the kind of classic neoconservative and conservative criticisms, are, we're not thrilled about some of the big government stuff. It's going to be wasteful at best and somewhat damaging in terms of unintended consequences and the like at worst. The good news for me, and I'll emphasize this part more, is that it's liberalism. I don't think it's progressivism. It was not a woke speech. It was not Elizabeth Warren-like. There were no denunciations of Wall Street, not really of rich people. There was kind of the normal FDR. You're right, the FDR Hubert Humphrey-like, hey, the middle class is what really made America great. The rich should pay a bigger share. They can afford to. But I think he even added, he ad-libbed, I think, I didn't see it in the prepared text, that line about there's nothing wrong with people on Wall Street, or I don't have anything against them. I can't remember how he put it exactly. But, they've been getting a disproportionate share of the returns. Now, whether that's economically correct, whether the economic consequences of increasing taxes on capital and on investment, those are all obviously things that should be debated. If we had a normal Republican Party or more of a normal conservative movement, we would be debating those things more aggressively, and we will be, I think. Even so, a lot of good economists are going to weigh in and say, well, this is unwise and this would be counterproductive. But I felt good that it is FDR, Hubert Humphrey liberalism, much more than woke progressivism. In that respect, he's both more ambitious than Obama in a sense, but he doesn't have all that conceit and pretense that history with a capital H is on his side, and he's transforming America. In that respect, it was very old-fashioned, traditional liberalism. He likes America. That last clip is kind of revealing, right? A progressive would not say that. Never, you've always been wrong to bet against America. He's very much for kind of American traditions as he sees them. He mentioned, for example, systemic racism, a phrase I'm not crazy about, twice, I think, in the speech, but very much quickly and didn't emphasize that as being the core of everything he was doing. So a lot of the practical things he's doing, like the police reform agenda, I think is going to end up being pretty sensible. So I felt good. Big government liberalism has its deficiencies, it has its drawbacks, it has its problems, but I think it's healthier than woke progressivism. And I think Biden is 80% on the big government liberalism side of things, and with a few occasional, hat tips to a woker and more progressive point of view than you and I would like.
Okay, so I think you have talked about this, but I want to stick with this distinction that you're making here between liberalism and progressivism, because there is a different feel to FDR, Hubert Humphrey liberalism than to the postmodern progressivism. So could you just dive into that a little bit more? Can we just unpack that, what you're actually seeing and the distinction you're making there?
Yeah, so it's these are big terms that encompass a lot of things, and the distinction isn't by any means altogether clear or airtight. There's a lot of sliding over from one to the other. Basically, big government liberalism isn't embarrassed about American history, though we have to improve, and that's what it means to be a liberal. And obviously, huge belief in the civil rights revolution, which you and I share, I think, and in other forms of improving the society we inherited. But I think it's pretty different from the sort of new left, to use a term from our youth, but now progressive critique of America. Biden's speech did not sound like the 1619 Project. It didn't sound like quite what we would have said maybe about American history, though we didn't talk much about history since he's a liberal. It's very present-oriented and near term oriented. But it was not 1619 Project sounding. There was not a lot of breastbeating about what America's done wrong. There was not a lot of criticism of previous errors in American foreign policy, for example, over the last 20 years, Iraq, as he would see it, I suppose now, or Vietnam or anything like that. It was in that respect very different from, think of Obama's early speeches, that Cairo speech and all that. But Biden isn't there in terms of foreign policy, in terms of a lot of domestic policy. There are areas where his party is woker and more progressive, and he slides into that, and his administration will slide into that to some degree. And I would have been nice to have, for example, a few sentences that were just a flat out defense of free speech against the illiberalism of the left. He didn't go there. So that would have been nice. But, to be fair, he didn't go in the other direction at all either. I was pretty struck. I don't think he ever used the word progressive, actually. So no denunciation of capitalism or anything like that. So I don't know. I think that's sort of, there are many, many aspects to this distinction, obviously. I think it's a little bit of one knows it when one sees it and one thinks of the rhetoric. It was striking. He did, it was interesting just on the more narrower front. I'd be curious to know what you think of this. I'll put it this way. I'm struck that the Obama people are not very gracious when they discuss Biden. There's an awful lot of sort of, maybe there's genuine disagreements, that's fine, but there's also kind of resentment, a little bit of passive aggressive kind of, refusal to really praise him much. I'd say if you look at some of their people on Twitter or watch them on TV, it reminds me a little bit of the Reagan-Bush transition. I suppose it's hard, but, it's interesting, Biden did not mention former President Obama. He didn't mention no former presidents, I think, except for FDR once. So that is kind of also characteristic of a certain kind of liberalism, which has its limits. It's kind of ahistorical. It's kind of, here are the problems. Here's what we can do. We can help families. We can, fix income inequality a little bit. We can deal with climate change. It's not as deep, maybe, or as thoughtful or as reflective as one might like, but it's also, in a way, more grounded and sort of commonsensical than a kind of fancy, highfalutin progressivism.
Well, and this is an interesting point, and I don't know what the internal dynamic here is, but your point that he mentioned FDR and not Obama. I'm guessing that this a lot of this analysis that he's becoming a transformational president, more FDR than Obama, has got to rankle the Obama folks who thought they were legend. And now for a lot of people in the Democratic Party, they're seeing Biden go where Obama did not want to go. Okay, so Susan Glasser has a great piece in the New Yorker about this about the speech and how Joe Biden has gone from describing himself as a transitional figure into what we saw last night. And she says, but transformation requires the passage of legislation, not just words. Washington is still Washington, as Biden knows better than anyone. And if you don't have the votes, you don't have the votes. Key Democrats, as well as Republicans, are skeptical of his costlier plans. And so far, no GOP votes have materialized for any of his major initiatives. At 100 days, the politics are less transformed than Biden's rhetoric might suggest. In addition to the stubborn facts of a tied Senate and a House where Democratic majority hangs on a handful of votes, the public remains as polarized and partisan toward this president as it did toward the last one. So here you have somebody with a very, very, very narrow lead, certainly nothing like a mandate. And yet he's acting as if he has this massive mandate. And I wonder if there's a little bit of dissonance there as well, where she's saying that even Democrats are a little bit, they're kind of like going, okay, there's a reason why Democrats have stayed away from this kind of, tax and spend stuff in the past. And now he's pushing this with the narrowest possible margins in Washington.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. So there are a couple of consequences one can draw from that. I mean, he sounds a little like FDR and LBJ but he doesn't have FDR and LBJ's supermajorities in Congress or the majorities even in being elected with huge majorities in 32 or 64, right? So I think that's a very key point. I think Biden and his people are aware that it's a 50-50 Senate and that he won by 4 or 5 points, not by 15 or 20. And I think they may feel that, look, I mean, the big agenda, again, I would qualify it by saying so big, traditional but big agenda. You don't pay much of a price, he may think, for proposing a lot of these things. And I think they know they're not going to get it all. And so, I mean, I guess the question is how what you call dissonance, which I think is a fair term, dissonance in music gets resolved, right? And so I sometimes, if it's a classical, composer, so, it's going to get resolved somehow. And it's going to get resolved less by Republicans, though there are some issues they do need Republican support on, than by also Joe Manchin and people like that. And so I think a lot of the stuff, you look at the proposals and you say, whoa, but a lot of it's going to end up not quite as big and not quite as bold. The tax hikes aren't going to be as high on on investment and so forth as they now look. I mean, and the question for but having said all that, I think it is important. I think they understand this. He said it a little bit in the speech. It really would be good to have a bipartisan compromise on a couple of issues, partly because it would be good to get good legislation passed, and partly because it would be important for the country, I think, just for the nation. I think Biden very much has that instinct. He said it again last night. The two most logical, I don't know, the economic stuff, it may just be that the Republicans aren't going to go with all the spending. They're not going to go with the tax increases, and that stuff's going to be done on pretty party line votes and reconciliation. Mm-hmm. Police reform, immigration, possibly, maybe voting rights, which we've discussed before about where there could be a compromise on that. That would be, I think, the kind of thing where Biden, where you could imagine a genuine bipartisan legislation, which won't be transformative, but would be important for the country. And I think police looks like it's first in line, partly, of course, because of recent events. And it will be interesting to see whether they do end up with Tim Scott and is negotiating, I guess, with is it Karen Bass? I think maybe as the lead in the House. I'm not sure exactly who's involved in
Booker
that
too. Yeah,
and obviously the administration's involved. So, I mean, I do think it would be important for the Biden administration not to get too carried away with the transformational stuff. I mean, they let people say that about them. They don't quite say it that way.
Right.
Biden, I don't believe ever uses that term because he sort of wants America. He doesn't dislike the way America's been. He just thinks a lot of things need to be done. And you and I would disagree with him about some of those things. And he thinks the last 40 years has been more, of a problem than probably we do in terms of some of the economic policies and stuff. But I don't know. So I'm hopeful that we end up somewhere. The transformational sort of rhetoric about him, I hope it doesn't go to their head. And I hope they'll do more big government stuff than we would like, but I hope they don't, I hope they do try to get serious compromises on some issues. If you're on the left, you look at that speech, there was a lot of stuff he didn't say, or he said kind of perfunctorily, that I think you'd say, well, hey, wait a second, wasn't this supposed to be part of our woke progressive agenda? I mean, one last point, there was that funny thing, which I got slightly involved in on Twitter last night with Joni Ernst, Senator Ernst, had that stood up on the Senate floor with that chart of 7 things that Biden was the liberal fantasy wish list, and then it got photoshopped, and then I was making fun. We're all joking around about the sex blend, but if you look at the actual chart, she had 7 things that were this is the liberal fantasy wish: DC statehood, ending the filibuster, raising taxes. That's the one thing she's right. She correctly mentioned. We can look it up. 6 of those items Biden didn't even mention in his speech. So he's pretty far from, I think, liberal, from progressive fantasy land.
Well, we're going to go back to Susan Glasser on this whole issue of dissonance, because I think that there is genuine dissonance. And she said, it's it's early days yet, but this is where Biden's true genius as a politician may lie, that he has turned his likability into a moderating asset, suggesting that an ideological agenda, when offered by a relatively non-ideological salesman, does not sound all that threatening. So that is the thing, is you look at him and you still think of him as non-threatening, as kind of moderate and centrist, and yet he is pushing this agenda. But then she says, look, in reality, he's not going to get all this stuff done, as you point out, but is there anything at all wrong with another hour or two of political fantasy in Washington, particularly after the last 4 years? At least this time it was not the Trumpian variant of grievance and division. Biden made no mention of culture wars or admiring references to brutal dictators. He did not gaslight the nation about criminal illegal aliens or interrupt his speech to give one of the country's highest honors to a man famous for disparaging feminazis. On the eve of his 100th day in office, Joe Biden never publicly uttered the name Donald Trump. But being the un-Trump means Biden has already accomplished the first and most important promise of his presidency. So I think she's looking at this pretty much the way I was looking at this. Is like, I'm still in that. He's so the un-Trump. The contrast is so dramatic, that I can sort of take a deep breath about some of the agenda items. But as you point out, more liberal than progressive. Speaking of, you mentioned the word woke several times. James Carville's making a lot of waves for an interview he did with Vox, telling Democrats not to use woke language. He actually said that to you first, right? You had a conversation, one of your Kristol conversations, with James Carville. So he's really invested in trying to steer Democrats away from using certain kinds of language, isn't he?
Yeah, using certain kinds of language and even kind of thinking in certain kinds of ways and being too, right. So I think that's, he's colorful the way he describes it. Yes, we were on this conversation and he said, the English faculty at Amherst has too much power in the Democratic Party, and that became a sort of a thing. And people replayed the clip and criticized him. They don't have much power. They should have more power, But I think he's a real political operative. He really looks at polling in a sophisticated way, not just in some sort of snapshot way. He looks at races. He talks to a million politicians. And he sees the danger, as he put it told me in the conversation. He saw in real time the damage that the defund the police stuff did to the Democrats, even though most of the members running in the House and so forth weren't for defunding the police. Almost none of them was for really defunding the police. And Biden tried to slap it down and has a record actually as being very sympathetic to the police, probably more sympathetic to police unions than we would like. But once that got some toehold, that took off, and then some of the dividing everything by race and ethnicity and so forth. Carville, I think, is very interesting because he's a Southern liberal, always been very liberal on civil rights and race, as Southerners, people who grew up there at a certain period, tend to be, because they really saw it up close, and I think that's one reason he was so attracted to Clinton. But he's very worried. But he's very close to a lot of Southern Black politicians like Jim Clyburn and in others in Louisiana and other states. And I think he very much hopes that the Clyburn form of progress on race will take hold in the Democratic Party, not the 25-year-olds and who want to have endless discussions about how just being not being racist and not being prejudiced and trying to look for policies to help everyone advance, including those, especially those who've been discriminated against, that's not good enough. We have to beat our breasts, and we have to go to 4,000 seminars on anti-racism, and every curriculum has to be featuring the 1619 Project. He sees that that's both. I think he just doesn't think it's right, first of all, and secondly, he sees the real political danger of that, and I very much agree with that. That really is. The culture war stuff is it's idiotic, a lot of what the Trump people do, and ridiculous, but it's not, it works to some degree.
No, it does work. Okay, so let's just shift gears, because I'm actually far more interested. I was far more interested yesterday in what happened to Rudy Giuliani.
No, you need to talk about that, but you've been on fire on that. And so,
I do want to talk about Rudy. And I wrote in my newsletter this morning, really, when you think about it, Rudy was always at the center of everything. He was the one constant in the Trump circus, right? This impresario of corruption. He's at the center of everything. Both of impeachments, the efforts to subvert both Ukraine and the election. So he's there. He's there everywhere. He's at the Four Seasons Landscaping. He's there at the insurrection. He's Trump's Roy Cohn. And, it's sometimes he's a clown, sometimes he's a thug, sometimes he's a liar. But it really, you could write a history of the Trump years and the Trump impeachments by just focusing on Rudy Giuliani. And now it may be all coming apart for this guy, because the federal investigators, the FBI, raided it. They seized cell phones. They seized computers from Giuliani. This is a big deal. They are stepping up this criminal investigation into Giuliani's dealings in Ukraine. So they executed a search warrant at 6 a.m. At his apartments and his offices, carting away all these devices and everything. That's pretty extraordinary in any context, particularly for, to take against a lawyer, let alone a lawyer for a former president. But especially in this particular case, this is a very, very big deal. And the fall of Rudy Giuliani is just going to be one of the, I know the word is overused, but tragedies, when you think about what he once was and how he was regarded and what is likely to happen to him now.
No, I agree. And I agree very much about his kind of centrality beginning at around 2018, I guess, to what was happening. Two things, just a note, reading just, sort of on Twitter almost, about reminding myself of what happened of the Ukraine story, which was mostly forgotten because so much happened since Trump was acquitted by the Senate. And what was at the beginning of February of 2020? That was terrible. And he deserved to be impeached and removed from office on
Yeah.
that. And the fact that the Republicans all said, well, that was okay. I mean, it emboldened him, and we had various other terrible things he did in 2020, obviously. But I mean, the outrageousness of it and the total centrality of Giuliani to that, acting at Trump's behest and with Trump's knowledge, which raises the question: what are they going to find about Trump in these Giuliani documents and phone messages and so forth? I mean, I don't know that it'll lead to an indictment of Trump. That's a little complicated. He was president at the time, whereas Giuliani was a private citizen, so you can really go after him quite justly for some of the things he did. But we might learn more of the kinds of things we learned a fair amount about in 2019. And again, that all was a little complicated, and there were a lot of this who knows about Ukraine and Russia and foreign names and foreign service officers who didn't like things, but you could make it look like, well, they were just the bureaucracy who was resisting Trump. But the degree to which, I always come back to John Bolton, who I've known a long time, who's very tough-minded conservative, not some kind of, State Department hand-wringing, oh, we're not quite following the right procedures here type. He worked very hard to become Trump's national security advisor. He finally got fired, but he wanted to stay there. He believed in a lot of that foreign policy. I didn't agree with him on a lot of that, some of it. But when he heard about Ukraine, he said, we've got to stay away from this drug deal. Remember that? And he said it in the White House in real time, not a year later, and he advised his subordinates, I think, not to go to certain meetings. And also, if I recall correctly, to go see the counsel, the lawyer at the National Security Council, to make sure they were kind of keeping arm's length from this thing. If John Bolton says this is a drug deal, this is probably illegal and extremely dangerous, I mean, then it is, And so I think for me, it was the Ukraine stuff came back. And then and also the way in which a lot of decent people fought against it, lost their jobs over it, whether they were ambassadors or career foreign service officers or Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, I mean, it was such a disgrace. And so I think the Giuliani thing, your instinct, I think, is right about this. Turning that rock over could be quite remind us of a lot of things and reveal some new things.
Well, you mentioned going back and reminding yourself of it. How much of it actually took place in real time, out in the open? I mean, this is the thing about a lot of the Trump scandals, that it happened in broad daylight. That Rudy Giuliani was saying, giving interviews saying that, yes, absolutely. He was pressuring the Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. They made no secret of the fact that they wanted to get rid of Marie Yovanovitch, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine. And you go back and you read the transcript of that call between Trump and the Ukrainian president, that set off the impeachment, and the way in which he Trump very explicitly tells the president Zelensky, I want you to meet with Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani's my guy. Rudy Giuliani is really reliable. He knows what's going on here. I want you to meet with Giuliani and the attorney general. So, I mean, the blast radius of this is going to be interesting, because that whole story of how, he worked with these guys like Lev Parnas and others to get rid of Marie Yovanovitch, that's going to be central to the case. The role of Bill Barr, I think, is going to be intriguing. How far did they go to block the investigation into Rudy before the election and also after the election? Was the firing of the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York related to this? Did they try to obstruct justice again? And I think we are going to learn some new things about this particular case. But again, I don't know what happened to some of these people. We asked this question: were they always like this? Did something change? But Rudy, and I've said this like many times before on the podcast, but I keep coming back to this. If Rudy Giuliani had died shortly after 2001, he would be a national legend. There would be parks, there'd be schools named after him all over the country. And he is going to be remembered as just this clownish, corrupt liar. And how you go from point A to point B is, I don't know whether you need historians or you need psychologists to explain that.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, one last point about it, as you were talking, of course, people kind of know this, but then they forget it. What was the point of the Ukraine thing? I mean, for Rudy, it was to make a lot of money off, getting foreigners to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars so they get access to the White House and to Trump. For Trump, it was to discredit Joe Biden and to get himself, make sure he had a good path to re-election. So, it's not like your typical foreign policy crisis, as it were, or misbehavior by a president, where people do overreach and do things they shouldn't do, or their subordinates do. Iran-Contra is a good example of this. But they thought they were acting for the national interest. You shouldn't go beyond what Congress authorizes. You shouldn't, obviously deceive Congress and so forth. But it wasn't, to get Reagan was in his second term. It wasn't to get him reelected or anything like that, and so it was, fighting the Cold War and whatever. And that would be true, I think, even of Obama for, he did things we don't approve of and think he shouldn't have done. And I think there was some misleading of the country on some issues and around the Iran deal and stuff. But, they thought it was the right thing for the country. I mean, this was entirely for Trump's personal political interest. And it really is worth remembering that. And it just, again, gets back to the incredible damage he did to all of our norms and, and guardrails. And there Biden has, I think, just by not doing the damage and then by some affirmative actions to restore them also, I think he and Merrick Garland could do a lot of good for the country.
Oh, I think so. No, that's an interesting point about the through line with a lot of these scandals, the Ukraine and the insurrection. It was all aimed at keeping power. It was all aimed at protecting Donald Trump's presidency, getting him a second term. I mean, that's what Ukraine was about, right? It was about how you smear your leading opponent, the personal interest of Donald Trump as well as the insurrection. And there's Rudy Giuliani, who was prepared to do anything and say anything. I suppose the biggest tell is the fact that we haven't heard much from Rudy lately. He claimed
at one Tucker. I think he's going to be on Tucker Carlson tonight, so you'll be wanting to set your clock for that. So
what could go wrong?
Yeah,
I mean, honestly, and I see that the former guy issued a statement from Mar-a-Lago denouncing the investigation. But one of the great realities that's changed, and you mentioned Joe Biden. These guys no longer can count on a pardon. And I wonder how much of their behavior really was based on the sense that, hey, no matter what happens, no matter how, things fall apart, I can always get the president to pardon me. I can always get a get out of jail free card, because that was kind of a ubiquitous presence over the last 4 years. And, reading the Mueller report, which is worth actually rereading, to realize that Donald Trump's obstruction of justice actually succeeded. And at the heart of that was his promises to certain people that, hey, if you keep your mouth shut, you can get pardoned. And you kind of wonder, the Matt Gaetzes of the world, the Rudy Giulianis of the world are now facing a stark new reality where they can't count on Donald Trump to bail them out. And that's got to be a rude awakening. I mean, there was a reason why these guys fought so hard to not acknowledge the reality of the election, right? I mean, this is a they're out in the cold now, and that is not irrelevant for them.
It is interesting, yeah. Trump's failure to pardon Giuliani, he hadn't been charged with anything, so it would have looked different from the pardons of Roger Stone and Flynn and all that. I mean, but still, he could have done it, and the failure to do that while he was a lame duck is pretty striking, I guess. And I wonder I don't know. I mean, yeah.
I don't know.
He's not a selfish guy, Trump. He doesn't think that much about other people, and so.
No, he doesn't. So I don't know what else should we talk about today. I've really been resisting talking about the 2024 field, because I think that at a certain point we have to live in the moment. Could we live in where we're at right now, as opposed to constantly be looking ahead to another election. So I've steered away from that. Although obviously you have Mike Pence, who's jockeying with Kristi Noem, who's jockeying with Nikki Haley, who's jockeying with Ron DeSantis. And all of them, though, completely beholden to, frozen by Donald Trump.
Who's likely to run, I think.
You think so?
I guess, partly because God knows what legal trouble he'll be in, and that being president he thinks, get him out of again and get other people out of. So, but it's a long way away. So who knows? I guess I remain. So when we were on the last podcast I was on, which I think a week ago, we sort of both, in a contrarian way, said maybe there could be a little more bipartisanship than people think, a little more coming up, some compromises on issues. I'm intrigued by that. I mean, how much does the mood change if there really is a deal on police reform? And you could still get 30 Republican senators against it, but if you get 15 or 20 for it, and you could lose on the left, incidentally, if they go with some of Tim Scott's proposals and don't quite go as far as some of the, really the activist groups want in curbing police officers' legal protections and so forth. I mean, it's not a huge, it's mostly a state and local issue, obviously, and so the effect of whatever happens might be somewhat limited. But I think that would be just I think Biden, he sort of emphasized that last night and made clear it was imminent. I think he'll probably want to spend the next few days still emphasizing his economic agenda. But I wouldn't be surprised if you got the real White House involvement there and then a deal. And that would be that would change the mood. I mean, if 2 weeks from now, Biden is there with some people from both parties, maybe not Mitch McConnell, maybe not Kevin McCarthy, but Tim Scott and some other people from the House, maybe Liz Cheney, right? And saying, you know what, I think we've got some legislation here we can get big majorities behind. That would make things feel somewhat different, I think.
Oh, I think you're right. Okay, so speaking of Liz Cheney, we talked about her on the podcast yesterday, but I continue to be. I mean, look, you've dealt with these Republicans up close and personal for years and years and years, and you know how many squishes they are. She's still. I make no secret of the fact that I'm kind of fascinated by her. That she was a solid Trump loyalist, a solid conservative. She voted against the impeachment on Ukraine, but she has been absolutely unmovable since January 6th. And her willingness to continually push back is really quite something. And she represents a state that went for Donald Trump by more than 40 points. So give me your take on Liz Cheney. What's going on there?
I mean, I've known her well over the years and worked with her quite closely at times. Then, sort of drifted apart, and falling out's too dramatic, but drifted apart from 2016 to 2020, really, where she, as you say, went along. She was different from Trump, and she, God knows, didn't defend the worst aspects of Trump, but she went along basically and supported him for election and re-election. Having said that, I would say that she is now doing what honorable Trump supporters should be doing, which is to say, we went along. We thought the policy trade-off was on the margin worth it. We felt we didn't have much choice. We even supported him for re-election. For me, that's a bit of a, that's a hard one to swallow, but whatever. But once he lost, he had to give up power. Honestly, he had to acknowledge what happened in the election. He couldn't perpetrate a big lie. He couldn't incite a rebellion. And the party itself, the reason they all went along, insurrection, but the reason they all went along was to get through these 4 years and then get the party back to a healthy state. I think that really was. Other people said that's what they were thinking. She really did believe that. And so when Trump went against that in a very big way, and she saw others going along with Trump going against that, 140 people or so in the House voting to overturn the election, I think she really was, she believed what she was saying privately and even publicly in terms of why she was accommodating Trump as much as she was. And so once that stopped being operative in a sense, she did what she said she would do and stood up for democracy, stood up for the truth, stood up for a different future for the Republican Party. So she really was making a calculation, one that I don't agree with, but still, about how much you could tolerate the 4 years of Trump if you move beyond Trump. And what's most amazing is not Liz Cheney in a way, it's all the others who've decided, actually,
Right.
that all that talk about how we're going to get beyond Trump, when I wasn't that much into that, really. It's okay to have some Trump. It's actually kind of okay to have a lot of Trumpism, and if I can be on Fox, I'm not going to even criticize Trump, really. I'm going to say I'd support Trump in 2024, and I'm going to not, God forbid, ever criticize the worst things that any conservative or Republican says, and I'm not going to vote to take Marjorie Taylor Greene off committee, the whole thing, right? So
Yeah.
I think she is the kind of most honorable version of a kind of accommodating to Trump that, as I say, I wasn't in favor of, obviously, but I sort of think was had decent motivations, and she just can't believe really that the others were all lying.
Yeah. So as we're talking, we're getting some new economic numbers in. And I think that in terms of the success or failure of the Biden administration, I think we started off by talking about the policies and the proposals and various other things. But obviously, he is well positioned right now to have this major American comeback. You get the sense of optimism where you feel we're almost through the the pandemic, and the economy is coming back. So the numbers that came out this morning, the U.S. economy grew 1.6% in the first quarter, which is a 6.4% annual rate. So that would mean that we're on our way to returning to pre-pandemic levels by summer. So this is interesting. I mean, the economy is shaking off some of the effects of the pandemic as spending grew, bolstered by the stimulus and an easing of restrictions. So if this pattern continues, Joe Biden is at least going to have an economic honeymoon,
But I would also say,
despite
Charlie,
all the divisions. Yeah.
don't you think? I think it will. I think you'll get much of the second package, the infrastructure package, through, partly because so much of that is the kind of thing, congressmen and senators of both parties can be for. There's a physical infrastructure, and some of the rest, the checks to families with children, has got some bipartisan support and some policy support. I think this will hurt his chances to then get to put it very roughly and broadly, like the final trillion or two of his 6 trillion. I think at that point people start to say, hey, we got an economy. If we have an economy humming along at 6, 7, 8%, we can tinker with the tax code to make it friendlier to families with children. We can maybe do a little bit to make sure help states and localities provide more pre-kindergarten education if people want that. But I suddenly the ambition of that kind of last tranche of spending, and if some of the other kinds of spending too starts to look a little less compelling, and maybe we should spend some money on clean energy. I'm not against that, but maybe we don't have to spend quite as much as Biden thought. So I think at that point you start to get back to a less transformational, more normal sort of politics with a Democratic administration and Democratic Congress, so leaning towards bigger government, but some of the oomph goes out of the urgency of it.
It could. I hope they don't. I hope the oomph doesn't go out of this debate that we're having now, or this discussion we're having now about the child tax credit, because that's an area where I do think that there's a potential for bipartisan cooperation. And the fact that conservatives have talked about this for some time. Mitt Romney's got a very interesting proposal. It's not the same as the Biden administration's proposal, but if you could make that permanent, that would be one of the major legacies of this administration, and it would be great to see that as a pro-family, pro-life kind of policy that the Democrats would put into place with support from some Republicans.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Bill Kristol, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Appreciate it very, very much.
Thanks, Charlie. I hope I cheered you up a little. As you said before we got on, you were a little cranky, but I feel after these 42 minutes, you're a little less. You're more at peace with the world.
I think so. But I had to get up really, really early this morning, so maybe that contributed to the crankiness. Hey, and thank everybody else for listening to the Bulwark podcast. A quick reminder: Thursday night we have the Bulwark Plus live stream. We'll be discussing this and a lot of other issues, including Rudy and the election reform. So, if you are a member of Bulwark Plus, you can tune in tonight at 8 p.m. I think it's going to be a lit conversation. We'll be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.